and to thank Dr. Brysk for this interview, which is actually part of the series of online events of the project sponsored by CAPES under the title of Foreign Policy, Regionalism, and International Cooperation in Times of Pandemic. Dr. Alison Brysk is the Mellichamp Professor of Global Governance in the Global and International Studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, specializing in international human rights. She has authored and edited 15 books on international human rights. Professor Brysk has been a scholar and lecturer in Argentina, Australia, Ecuador, France, Spain, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, South Africa, and Japan, and has held Fulbright Fellowship in India and Canada. Dr. Brysk was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. for the 2013-2014 academic year. Well, having said that, it seems quite obvious that the topic of this conversation will be human rights in times of pandemic. And as previously agreed with Dr. Brysk, I'm gonna ask her some questions on this subject. So, would you say that the pandemic has changed the way in which violations of human rights occur around the world? If yes, how?
Thank you so much for this opportunity to reflect and to maintain our global conversation about the importance of human rights and how they affect all aspects of the human condition and of our organization of power in our societies, which has been stressed now more than ever and which we need to recover in order to survive both physically and socially, the pandemic, and to rebuild our world in a way that's more meaningful and sustainable. So in terms of the changes which we have been trying to track across a lot of issue areas, I will just say first sort of the big picture. I see three different aspects of this. One is the kind of very top level, institutional level, the political level of what people are calling pandemic power grabs. So we have a number of regimes where either democracy is in decline or there have been authoritarian elements, and the management of the public health crisis has been used to further diminish citizen power and accountability, or to put restrictions on mobility and on freedom of speech and of political protest. I think particularly about Iran and crackdowns there, and they've had a particularly severe pandemic. That would be more on the chronic authoritarianism side and kind of ramping up the political prisoner situation there. But in terms of declining democracy, right in the heart of Europe, Hungary has quite openly and frankly used the pandemic to suspend parliament and give extraordinary powers to the president. So we have that kind of phenomenon taking place, and actually taking place on every continent and in every region. We have a kind of connected political institutional question of a lack of accountability and a stress on accountability mechanisms for governance that has been particularly stressed in the pandemic, including public health governance, including use of funds and in the United States, where we've had a disastrous governance experience with the pandemic. And we've also had things like deployment of federal police forces and agencies to regions of protest in part with the excuse of the pandemic. We've had dismissal of accountability agencies in terms of the funding being distributed as relief for the pandemic, and real questions about how that funding is being used. We've had some very difficult judicial decisions about management of the pandemic. So there's that level of accountability problems. And, people who are trying to trace some of the breakdowns in management and the responsibilities. We've had also built in to the attempts to reopen the U.S., we had clauses in our COVID pandemic relief funding that they were trying to include clauses of immunity of liability for corporations or employers who force their workers to go back to work, and for essential workers being forced to go back, that if they got sick, they couldn't sue, they couldn't get any legal relief, and the condition of the federal aid was this clause. So that is such a clear impact. But the biggest, I think, and most structural and deepest impact is that the pandemic has revealed and stressed and deepened the intersecting vulnerabilities of people who have lacked different kinds of rights chronically, and who are having specific kinds of rights acutely threatened, and their lack of status, lack of political power, lack of agency, lack of legal standing to contest this is really being stressed by the pandemic. So just to quickly list, and then I want to go into discussing these, and some of your questions I think will speak to this also. The intersecting vulnerabilities of refugees are tremendous, and we know that forcibly displaced people are already suffering both increased incidence of COVID, lack of physical spacing, lack of access to resources, lack of options. We know that people who are imprisoned, and in certain societies like the United States, to some extent Brazil, to some extent Russia, where we have mass incarceration practices, which coincide with vulnerabilities of poverty, of race, and that prisoners are more subject to infection, are not being given protection or tools or resources to deal with the pandemic. So there is, again, a complex intersection of impact there. We know that in general, across the global South, that less developed or emerging economy countries that have less developed public health systems and fewer resources and less governance capacity as well. And we know that women and the upsurge in gender-based violence, women's increased vulnerability, both as often frontline essential workers in certain, for example, in medical settings, and the feminization of poverty in some areas. So women who are single mothers and heads of household and living in crowded multi-generational households are going to also face particular challenges in terms of their rights, their physical integrity rights, as well as their social and health rights.
Okay, yes. Well, I'm gonna go to the second questions, and actually some of the questions might mention some aspects that you've already mentioned during your answer. But let's see. How do inequality?
Well, it's sort of intended as an overview. Actually.
How do inequalities between countries impact on the consequences and responses to the pandemic regarding human rights?
Yes, I think that the kind of triple challenge here is that countries that are less developed, less democratic, and that often coincides, are countries that have lower resources to deal with the pandemic. They're countries that also have less visibility, less influence in international organizations, less connection with global governance networks that can help them. I think that that's all pretty straightforward to see. But I think a third aspect that hasn't been attended to as much that we should really think about is economic dependency and the ways in which that plays out. So inequalities between countries are not just inequalities of resources and inequalities of governance and institutions and visibility. But also in terms of dependency, autonomy, and capability, which translates into ability to cope with any kind of crisis, whether it's a natural disaster, a pandemic, environmental, climate change and things. So I see the kind of two real forms of dependency that I think are resonating very strongly right now. One is supply chains, and how a lot of countries, even internally, are having shortages of food, of medical supplies, of all kinds of things. I've heard some terrible things coming out of India, South Asia. One thing I want to point out, I did a little analysis with one of our graduate students that I believe will appear in the Open Global Rights website soon, in a month or two, about reproductive rights and women's shrinking access to reproductive rights, to medical care, but also to, for example, pharmaceutical forms of abortion medication, which is a timely gap and can be life-saving and critical for women who are either cut off themselves in lockdown, but also sometimes the drugs can't get into the countries that need them, where and they can't be distributed. So there are interruptions in medical care besides medical care for COVID, other kinds of medical care that have particular impacts and on vulnerable populations and very gendered impacts. But turning to the other side, besides supply chains, we also have people chains, right? Migrant workers, hopefully not literally people chains, but there certainly has been an increase in human trafficking and vulnerability to trafficking because of the pandemic, economic declines, lack of visibility, cutoff of some of the policing and positive monitoring capacity. That's an issue, and I've seen some evidence of that. I attended a webinar the other day where some people who'd worked in some of the European Europol agencies say that they are seeing an uptick in human trafficking. But even voluntary migrant workers are sometimes being cut off from their labor, being displaced. There have been some incidents where in, I believe, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, certain African workers. I think it was Ethiopian workers who had been migrating to Lebanon were pushed back. They were actually evicted from the homes where they had been living as domestic workers and dumped at their consulate and eventually shipped home. And now their country of origin is struggling to absorb them. Plus, now they've been exposed along their train of travel. They've been exposed possibly to COVID, and so they're quarantined. I mean, there are so many rippling impacts. So migrant workers are vulnerable already. Their work is often disrupted. Their residence, which is highly contingent, has been disrupted. And sometimes getting back into their country of origin is highly problematic. So I wanted to highlight that.
Okay, thanks. Well, does the lack of access to social rights lead to economic and health insecurities that aggravate the COVID-19 effects for the most vulnerable populations? How?
Yes, well, let's continue first with, I can see 3 or 4 ways, 3 or 4 kinds of social rights that I think are affected. But let's continue following from the last question with the theme of work and labor rights. So one of the most important social rights is the right to safe and just and fair employment. And so we have people who are precarious workers who have lost employment, who have lost employment even in the developed countries, in the gig economy, who have no social security, maybe aren't even eligible for unemployment. And we have the vulnerability of migrant workers, as I've discussed. We have in underdeveloped countries and the United States, where people's health care is dependent upon employment. I mean, this isn't true in Europe and civilized countries, but where if you lose your job, you lose your access to healthcare. So there's a link to vulnerability, and we are seeing consequences of that resonate around. We have people also, we've had some labor actions in the US where, minimum wage workers in, say, delivery firms like Amazon are forced to go to work on the front lines. They can't unionize. They don't have any protections or guarantees. Sometimes they've been fired for trying to protest. So, there's a really serious, employers are asked to give personal protective equipment to their employees, but it's often not been adequate. Or we've also had waves of infection in meat packing plants in the US. That seems to be a particularly dangerous industry, the way people are spaced or can't be spaced in the meat packing operations. It's an industry that employs a lot of immigrants. We've had an intersection between immigration vulnerability, between the nefarious immigration policies of the current administration and their attempts to, deport people and drive people underground. And then these are the workers who are concentrated in this dangerous industry, becoming infected, not daring to come forward and receive medical care, contributing then to infecting their households and communities. This is a very strong intersection between different social rights and different vulnerabilities in terms of healthcare. So I've gone sort of from labor rights to healthcare and lack of access to social rights. But let's also talk about housing. Let's talk about the large homeless populations, places like the United States, Brazil, India, and how we see that lack of access to housing is a contributor to vulnerability to the pandemic. It's also a contributor for the wider society. Society is paying the bill now for chronic denial of the right to housing. In fact, in Los Angeles, they're struggling to activate proposals that have been discussed for a long time to give people access to housing, to get them off the street into unused hotels, into different facilities that are being transformed. And that should be happening for their own sake, to provide people their right to housing. It hasn't happened for their own sake. It's happening now so that they get off the street and don't infect everybody. So, the potential positive spin on this is that we could see that this crisis will bring out the interdependence to the point that we have a revival of a social welfare discourse and a social democracy discourse. But in the short run, it is unfortunately only a vulnerability. One last social rights issue that I think has to be discussed is water and the right to water, access to water. And, this is a conversation that has just been taking off in the international organizations on human rights and the interdependencies of water and sanitation to development, to gender, to health across the board, and for people like refugees. And now, like with housing, it becomes acutely important and stressed in the pandemic, where access to water is one of the only protective measures that we have.
Well, would you say that both gender and race exacerbate the negative effects of the pandemic?
Yes, clearly. I will circle back to one thing I've already brought up about gender and women's rights. And I would say, but I'll add a few things to that. Certainly, women's rights are stressed in terms of gender-based violence, measurably increasing. We have firm evidence from at least a dozen countries, and I participated in a Wilson Center seminar on this, of market increases in gender-based violence due to the pandemic. We have these issues of women's health care that I've discussed, and women's access, particularly to reproductive health care. And I talked about access to, medical abortion and things like that, but also, of course, maternal health care, childbirth conditions in medical facilities that have been impacted by the pandemic are particularly difficult. We also have, as I mentioned before, the feminization of poverty, and that women worldwide, but particularly in developing countries, are more likely to be, single heads of household, more likely to be in lower paid essential work or informal work or domestic work, and that these are the places that are suffering the most in terms of loss of jobs, in terms of jobs that don't guarantee you access to healthcare, and to some extent in terms of supply chains as well. One last piece is that the lockdown conditions, particularly in more developed countries where women have more work outside the home, and that's the expectation, has put a tremendous stress on childcare, lack of childcare, is impeding a lot of women, I mean, massive numbers of women, from participating in their work and their professions from home. And what we have always called the double shift in feminist thought, about women working outside the home and then coming home and working a full shift. Well, now women are working, many women are working the double shift all day long, and both struggling personally and in some cases not being able to fulfill those roles in ways that have a terrible impact. So that's gender. Oh no, one more thing about gender. Gender doesn't just mean women, of course. It also means sexual minorities and LGBTQ populations. And I've been kind of signaling and mentioning like the Wilson seminar or the piece that's going to go on open global rights. So I want to signal that this isn't published yet, but I am aware of a survey that's taking place right now in Mexico through one of our graduate students about the differential impact on LGBTQ people of the pandemic. And it looks like, along with the increase in gender violence against women in kind of standard hetero pair households, there are other forms of violence that LGBT people are more subject to. We have, for example, trans sex workers who are subject to different kinds of repression, different kinds of violence on the street or trying to get off the street, access to essential medications that may be specific to management of chronic HIV, and or trans people needing supply chain essential medications. So there's a whole other set of issues. They are gendered and they are stressed in different ways, intersecting with the pandemic. In terms of race, so we have chronic issues of racialized poverty and racial injustice, and all the lack of access to social rights that go along with racial injustice and inequity issues worldwide, with particular resonance in certain societies such as the United States and Brazil. So I think we have those issues as a widespread problem. And we know, to the extent we can track, that the incidence of COVID and unfortunately the death rate from COVID is higher in Black and brown populations. In the United States, I've seen a little bit from Europe, I can only imagine in places like Brazil. I don't know if you have the data, but it certainly appears that would be the case. I think we're also seeing an increased vulnerability to police violence and other mass incarceration and the vulnerability that brings.
Yes. What are your views about the way countries governed by far-right leaders are dealing with COVID-19?
Okay, so much to say here, but I will try to be brief and general, because I think that is the most constructive thing right now. I think that first of all, one thing that I've been thinking about is how far-right narratives are really connected to gender issues and to the backlash against feminism. So far right means a set of political economy policies, but what the far right looks like these days is also a nationalist set of policies. And so, I mean, classic conservatives who may favor very conservative economic policies don't necessarily identify with the far right. There's a kind of neoconservative far right sector, and that is identified with neoliberal economics, nationalism, and patriarchy. I mean, open, flat out patriarchy, right? And so we've seen worldwide regressions by this set of leaders on women's rights across the board. For example, we've had the downgrading of Russia's domestic violence legislation a few years ago, bans on teaching, speaking about gender issues. I know that has happened in Brazil. It's happened in Hungary. There have been shifts in the United States, not as much domestically, but in terms of the kind of discourse that can be used in diplomatic settings in U.S. representations in the United Nations. Constant struggles about abortion law, attempts during the pandemic to restrict access to legal abortions by declaring abortion a non-essential medical procedure, and therefore not allowing people to go to clinics in certain states. So what I would say is that we're not just talking about far right, we're talking about patriarchal nationalist leaders. I think that these leaders, and I would particularly highlight Bolsonaro, Trump, and Modi, manifest a combination of usually initial denialism regarding COVID, often followed by crackdown and misuse of government agencies for repression of citizens' rights, but also ultimately a kind of dysfunctional approach because they manipulate opposition to science, and they manipulate solidarity and, are opposed to various forms of citizen organizing and cooperation in a way that systematically frustrates any sort of rational and humane management of a public health crisis. I would point out particularly that in Brazil, we can see a really clear contrast between Brazil's relatively successful management of HIV/AIDS, which was certainly, very, very problematic. And, there were a lot of people in Brazil who were vulnerable and who were affected. The government was constrained in resources. The government has the dependency issues, a lot of migration. I mean, it had all the structural factors affecting this, a public health epidemic were pretty similar. And the only thing that's really different now in Brazil at a social level is the leadership and the government. And so, it's kind of like a social science experiment, and a very unfortunate one, that we can really track what difference leadership makes. Yes. So actually, what I would like to suggest is that we then we'll just set aside for a moment question 6 and go to question 7, because the opposite, what is the opposite of a far right government? It's a feminist government.
Yeah.
And I've actually been working on a piece about this too. I mean, this is exactly what I'm interrogating. It's early days, so I don't have fully developed scholarly work yet, but I am starting to look at these patterns on the basis of the social science understandings of human rights that I've developed over all these books. So, you know, that's where this is coming from, and that's why I think it's so nice to have these interviews, so that we can begin to connect our long-standing analyses and scholarship with interpretations of the contemporary reality, and anticipate how social science needs to keep moving in order to comprehend and analyze and hopefully improve our response. And by our response, I mean scholarly response, social response, and please, governance and policy response. So, so back to the, you know, the negative nationalist patriarchal governments. The positive, you know, the leaders of the countries that are the COVID champions, that have done the best, are care economies. They are often female-headed governments. But even when they're not headed by a woman, so for example, Canada and the US are a marked contrast. Canada is not headed by a woman. However, Canada has a much higher level of gender equity and women's representation in politics and in terms of income equity and other issues than the United States. It's just amazing, because we're so similar in so many ways. This is one of the big differences. And you end up with a much healthier society before COVID in Canada, right? Better healthcare and a healthier society. So I'm working on a piece called Why Feminism is Good for Your Health. If we look just topically, timely at who are the COVID winners, who are the COVID champions, it's New Zealand, Norway, Germany, Taiwan, where I just spent some time in the fall of last year. And it is that we have this body of social science research that suggests that overall gender equitable societies are healthier, more peaceful, more internationalist, more prone to become knowledge economies as they develop, and have more collaborative governance styles. Right. So this doesn't mean that having a queen is going to stop war, right? It means a more feminist society overall that's more balanced in power relationships. And it means you're going to develop a society with these characteristics, which turn out to be good characteristics for health outcomes. Right. I mean, I can speak to Taiwan. That's a very, kind of telling example. So Taiwan has a female president. She was just, the first female president was elected for the first time in 2016. She was just reelected in 2020. Taiwan is a small country. It's 23 million people. It's relatively developed, and has developed pretty quickly. It's one of, the Asian tiger economies, but it's not just developed. It has very widespread development with a very high level of education. It's one of the economies that developed by investing in human capital, extremely high level of education, one of the lowest levels of income inequality in Southeast Asia. Actually, there's better income equality in Taiwan than in China, despite, the communist revolution. And Taiwan, of course, was massively exposed to potential COVID because of its origins in China, and has a lot of travel, tourism, and exchange with China. I mean, they politically have conflicts, but at a economic and personal level, there's a lot of flow back and forth. But Taiwan has an excellent public health system. They have knowledge-based governance. They have committees of experts on everything. And the government doesn't impose policies. When any social problem arises, they convene a committee of experts. They gather data, and they have a very strong tendency to collaborate, to have multi-agency partnerships. I mean, this is sort of how feminism translates into nerdy public policy, political science. And they're very multilateralist. They're, excluded from a lot of international organizations, but they promote every international network and exchange they can. So Taiwan came up with management protocols. They locked down very fast. They shut off travel. They set up screenings. They had quarantine. But in other dimensions, they also have this medical technology industry. They started producing masks like crazy. They exported masks to their neighbors, which is humanitarian, but it's also smart. It's protecting you. So this is how these kinds of issues translate into concrete material society-wide gains. More consultation, more democracy. People were happy to comply because they trust their government, and it's a win-win.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to the sixth question. How does the dehumanization play a part in the pandemic-driven narrative of authoritarian governments?
Yeah. So I think that dehumanization is the theme that underlies every form of human rights violation and every form of vulnerability. And I am proud to be part of a generation, like literally 20 years or a little bit more, of moving the study of human rights beyond the study of law and treaties and standards toward the study of power relations and systems and practices. And what we see beneath all the debates about laws and forms of government and different baskets of rights and who has them and different categories of people is a sort of constant dialectic struggle between dehumanization and empowerment. So every form of human rights abuse, whether it is chronic discrimination like an apartheid system, whether it's genocide, war crimes, struggles within democracy, struggles over migration and citizenship rights, gender violence, begins with someone who has power or wants power, trying to distance and push out of the category of humanity with all of the regard and recognition that comes with that. So trying to cut our natural solidarity, that is our historic tendency. And the response, whether it comes from international, the response that pushes back against dehumanization is empowerment. And empowerment begins with recognition. Now, the response can come down from an international agency. It can come up from civil society. It can come across from networks across countries and peoples. And the more we can do that, the better. Specifically, when we see a crisis, it's very important to track who is being recognized and included, who is being excluded, who's being stigmatized, who's being physically distanced, but who's being morally distanced. So the warning sign and the trigger, again, when any kind of massive power grab or human rights abuse is taking place, whether it's at the micro level within society, in a household or between groups, or whether it is a government, is that they will signal, they'll start to use dehumanizing language. They will start to push people physically distant in, a ghetto or a camp, or send people away. They will start to conceal the humanity and downgrade the humanity of people. And so, we have been seeing that taking place. In India, for example, there was this draconian sudden decree that there was going to be a lockdown, and everybody had to leave areas that they had migrated to. And then transportation was shut down. And so we had these invisible and dehumanized migrant workers. These are internal migrants within India. There were millions of migrant workers who had been living in the streets, working inside people's homes, working in mines and factories and hidden industries that were literally invisible. They were not even noticed, and were put into perilous situations, displaced, and then sometimes attacked by the police because they were in motion trying to get back to some form of refuge. So that's just a concrete illustration.
Okay, Dr. Brysk, the last question,
yes.
which I think it's kind of wrapped up everything. What are the lessons brought by the COVID-19 pandemic for human rights?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 or 4 things we can conclude, and I've been talking about them as we've gone along, but just to sum up. So one is the interdependence of people, states, conditions, and of globalization itself. The famous conclusion of the Vienna Conference, the United Nations Vienna Conference on Human Rights, 1994, was that human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. I think we learn more every day about what that means and how important it is. I think the second is that we have been learning for the past generation that liberalism is sort of necessary but not sufficient. So having liberal rights and freedoms is certainly important. It by itself can never deliver, and that liberalism by itself can degenerate into economic neoliberalism. And so if liberalism is not fully extended into the interdependent rights-based empowerment, it can't stand. I think the third lesson is that, not only is feminism good for your health, but more than that, or part of that is part of the broader lesson that solidarity can save your life, and that all of our forms of cooperation and collaboration are not just right, but necessary for our survival as individuals, as societies, and even as a species. And then something that I haven't talked about, but I have certainly a lot of colleagues, human rights scholars, working on environmental rights and the interconnections between environmental issues and human rights and environmental justice. I think most of us have been aware of this, sympathetic to it, but I think that our karma is really catching up with us in terms of the way in which climate change and crowding and mistreatment of animals and all of these kinds of environmental harms and problems are translating into threats to human rights. We've known about this in a general sense, and pandemics are part of the direct linkage between environmental problems and human rights problems.
Yes, Dr. Brysk, I'm very, very grateful for your collaboration with this project. Your interview was really great, was fabulous. I don't remember how long ago I spent such a nice, talk through internet with someone that could, help us to think about these connections of so many problems that, for what human rights can incorporate. So I really would like to thank you once again for sharing with us your knowledge and your thoughts on this subject. I hope to be in contact very soon, and hopefully to meet in the normal way that you used to meet in the past. And I also like to thank Juliana Pinto and Lívia Avellan for helping us to conduct and to prepare all this interview. And thank you very much indeed, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks to you, and very much looking forward to continuing the conversation online and in real life.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.